All right. So, to start off with, I just wanted to ask you to introduce yourself if possible.
Sure. My name is Kamal Franklin. I am a founder, the founder of Community Movement Builders, a grassroots organization based here in Atlanta, but with members at large and some chapters across the country. Originally, I'm from Brooklyn, New York, where I've been a long time community organizer. I've also been a practicing attorney working on civil rights cases, criminal cases, and some contractual work. So that's me in a nutshell.
All right. And just to introduce myself, my name is Marte White. I'm a member of Community Movement Builders, and also work with the Spirit of Mandela campaign. I am a uh, uh, a new African Marxist. I also I identify as a revolutionary Black nationalist, and I just do activism here in this Atlanta area, and I'm glad to be here. Now, what we're talking about here is the myth of the Black Mecca. So, a lot of people really do see Atlanta as being a type of city that is like almost a utopia for Black people, where you can make it big, you can really get your money up. Um, so I just wanted to hear what you had to say about income inequality in Atlanta, the reality of the class differentiation that exists here.
I think Atlanta, particularly for Black folks, but not exclusively, is a very stratified, class stratified city. You definitely have let's say, an upper class or elite class, a bourgeois class, that is generally made up of obviously elected officials slash politicians. Then you have your Black professionals in terms of lawyers, doctors, and then you definitely have a scale that includes Black business owners. And so, whether or not that's folks that are in the entertainment business, people who are now into development and so forth. So, you definitely have that strata of a Black elite. But I think mixed with that, you have the majority or the masses of Black folks who are working class and poor. And they are the people who have lived in Atlanta, kept Atlanta going. They are the folks who've come from outside of Georgia and settled here in Atlanta, those who are native to Atlanta. And then you also have, in terms of some of the class stratification, you have folks like me who were told and saw Atlanta that this was a great city to come into because cost of living at one point was a certain amount, that the opportunities, quote unquote, were greater here. So I think there's a great mix of things that are happening in Atlanta. But I think, it's sold as the city that's too great to hate, the city on the move. But I think, like most of the urban areas that we all come from, when you take a careful, close-up look at it, you can very easily see that Atlanta is a city that centers itself on making rich people, particularly rich white folks, comfortable. Secondarily, that has again that class of Black folks who want to be a part of that milieu, a part of that action, and then you have a working class and poor Black folk who are struggling at the bottom, who are trying to live day to day, who now at this stage in Atlanta's history is actually getting pushed out of the city because they can no longer afford the prices of housing, whether that's rentals or ownership. And so they're no longer able to afford Atlanta. And this has happened under the leadership of Black mayors and Black city councils for now going on 40, 50 years.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. Yeah, we see a lot of gentrification, a lot of Black people being pushed out of Atlanta. And even at this point, it's no longer a majority Black city, and that kind of it shows how the Black leadership class has kind of worked against the broad, as you said, like majority of Black people who, are like poor, who are impoverished, and who do not have the same conditions as a lot of what is depicted about Atlanta. But I also wanted to ask this. So Atlanta, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the instruments of the state, right? Atlanta, um, of course, has like a police force, like every city, um, and we have our problems with police brutality and police violence against the masses of people. Um, so I just wanted to ask you about your viewpoint on the on Atlanta's police, because there are quite a few Black police here. But does that make a difference?
It doesn't make any difference, right? It doesn't make any difference, right? We've got a lot of Black police in Atlanta who, again, people like to make these things personality things. They may be nice people. They may treat their dogs well. They may be supporting their families. Obviously, these jobs have been given to working class Black folks as a way to incorporate them in the economy, but to do it in a certain way where they're now the foot soldiers for development. They are the foot soldiers for private property. They are the foot soldiers for the politicians and the elected officials to cry crime and to control and regulate poor and working class Black communities. So it doesn't matter whether or not Atlanta's police are Black or white. There may be some things around the edges where, of course, every now and then something like that may come in handy. But for the most part, the police do what they're told to do. And when they're told to move people off the block, they move people off the block. When they're told that they need to make arrests, they make arrests. And just like anybody else, when someone has the nerve to suggest that they shouldn't be harassed or they shouldn't be arrested, they react in a way that police are trained to react, which is to take control of the situation and to do everything from on the light end, yelling at you, on a heavier end, handcuffing you, arresting you, beating you, and to the ultimate end of eventually taking out a gun and potentially shooting you. So Atlanta police basically is the public army, right, for the larger state apparatus or city apparatus. And in this particular case, again, there may be some things around the edges, but the Atlanta's police force is here to control the general population, and that's what they do.
Right, right. So when push comes to shove, we have that saying, every brother ain't a brother, even if the police force is full of Black people, it doesn't necessarily make a difference, because the police force has its function, and that function ultimately represses the great masses of people on the behalf of the state. I did want to ask also if you knew anything about the history of civil rights struggles in Atlanta and had any kind of comments on that.
Yeah. But I think Atlanta has a particularly interesting history, as sort of alluded to earlier, where a lot of the civil rights leaders, of course, and most famously Dr. King, come out of Atlanta. But most of the struggles they engaged in were not here in Atlanta, but across the South and then later on in the North, Midwest, and so forth. Because post the Atlanta riots, as they were called, there was basically an agreement, right, that was made between Black politicians or Black leadership, we should say, and the larger white, not larger, but the white industrialists, I said, white developers, the white elite who controlled the money, which was, we don't want all that civil rightsy stuff, demonstrations, possible rebellions happening here. So let's find a way to smooth that out, right? Let's find a way to smooth that out. And eventually what took place was, because, as we spoke about, Atlanta was either near or close to a majority Black city. The role of the Black leadership here in Atlanta, particularly, was to paint a picture of this was an idyllic Southern city where Black folks and white folks got along. right? And then eventually, Black folks who, again, because of our numbers, were able to, let's say, succeed and or take over in terms of electoral offices. And under the guise, right, that they can obviously push for business inclusion as Maynard Jackson did. But other than that, they would keep things rolling as it was. They would work on the behest and behalf of white capital. And in return, they could do the day-to-day running of the city, which may be some benefits for them, the members of their families, people in their circles, which of course did again create a certain layer of Black wealth, but comparatively speaking, a very minuscule layer of Black wealth. And so, where other people's had, other cities had strong challenges to, let's say the overt segregation, just the strong challenges weren't met here. And I think that's also, to this day led us to a point where this whole idea, again, this crafted sort of propagandist idea that Atlanta is the Black Mecca, it's led us to continually believe that things are different here because there's Black leadership and there's a layer of Black wealth. Where at the same time, this Black leadership has been primarily responsible for guiding and letting gentrification happen. It's been primarily responsible for ending public housing in Atlanta, right? For paying homeless people to leave during the Olympics. Again, for allowing the prices of homes and so forth to go up, for allowing the police to continue to play their traditional role. So it's opposed to being some sort of Black left or thinking outside the box. The mayors and the city councils of Atlanta have been just as moderate and or slightly liberal as any other sort of city across the country, in that it doesn't do anything but keep the ball rolling for white capital for the most part.
Exactly. A lot of those benefits that may have occurred because of Black leadership in the city oftentimes only benefit a certain class of Black people, but not the majority of Black people who kind of are put in danger by these the kind of horrific conditions that people are put in because of the type of society that we have. Um, but I did also want to ask, do you think that that there was any influence of like this idea of the Atlanta Compromise um, on the way that Atlanta turned out um, with uh, with the famous Booker T. Washington, just basically work, keep your head down, and like eventually like all sorts of um, strife that has occurred between Black people and white supremacy will just go away. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think Atlanta is unique to the issue of, let's say, bootstrap politics or keeping your head down and working hard and making it. I just think Atlanta has taken it to a certain propagandistic level, where, again, the infusion of conversation, when you hear elites talk, particularly Black elites, there's always a sense that it's your fault, particularly in Atlanta, if you can't strive or get ahead. No matter what the statistics say, no matter how much you can look at the social mobility numbers and show that Atlanta is the worst in the nation of any sort of social mobility happening. The idea that some either hip hop artist or, again, an industrialist developer has somehow made some money, then that translates into, then we all can do it. And then again, because it's linked with the city government, there's that pride issue of, like, again, it's either the first Black this or the first Black that, or it's, look, we own this or we own that. And so therefore, this is our city. Well, it's not our city, because still, when you look at the differences in terms of wealth and who really owns Atlanta, there's a development class. There's obviously the invitation to Fortune 500 corporations, which are setting up headquarters here. And they're the ones who really run Atlanta. And then we have to also look at the fact that we live in the larger state of Georgia, which, again, some of the demographics and shifting is happening as we're talking here around more liberal type leadership. But that's fairly recent, and it still does not account for the fact that this city is run by extremely conservative white elements, right? So again, as the openings that have happened in Atlanta, and not only for certain Black people, but even the LGBTQ community, right, that calls in some ways Atlanta a particular space of hope and openness, particularly here in the South. Um, Even that becomes sort of the part of the facade of Atlanta being a city too big to hate, whereas really what they're saying is, as long as you allow us to continue to accumulate capital, you can do what you want to do within a certain realm of things, but don't interject or interfere with how capital is accumulated, who is the ownership interest, and how we get paid. You can shop in stores, you can wear, whether it's red, black, and green or rainbow colors, you can do whatever you want to do, but don't intercede in how capital is functioning here in Atlanta. Otherwise, then there will be problems. And so, and I'm assuming we're going to get into it a little bit, but I think the Rayshard books slash George Floyd incident shows us that post that, the new crime narrative that's going on around the country, but also stationed here in Atlanta, as well as the building of the facility called, that we euphemistically call Cop City, shows us the side that capital and politicians, elected officers are on when it comes to what's their reaction to the masses fighting back.
Exactly. It's very disturbing how it is apparently possible for the city to be able to present this type of facade of progressiveness or of freedom for various different types of oppressed groups, when in reality, it only exists, as you said, like within the confines of what allows capital to continue to accumulate. And as soon as it goes outside of those confines, then the powers that be crack down. You know what I'm saying? On the people, right? And all of that stuff goes away. I also wanted to just ask a little bit of if you knew anything about, the history of ending public housing in Atlanta, the history of uprooting Black neighborhoods. We there's even among the terrible things that have occurred, even that case of many child murders occurring in Atlanta. Does that show the true nature of the city?
Well, I would say, particularly with the bringing of the Olympics here, right, which was done mostly under Andy Young, which is pivotal to think about how Andrew Young, who was always considered more of the right wing part of the civil rights movement or Dr. King's team, the more capitalist in nature. I think there's some famous times where Dr. King actually literally called Andy Young like the capitalist or whatever. So it's interesting that again, Andy Young becomes mayor, and it's not, and preceding him and after him, the mayors have continued on this line of, we get the Olympics in, and it's a showpiece we want. So we don't really care whether or not homeless people or houseless people eventually get houses or homes, have wraparound services. We want it to look nice and shiny, because by looking nice and shiny, it means that more corporate offices may one day find their way down to Atlanta. And so to make it nice and shiny, they literally paid people again to get on buses, to leave Atlanta with one-way tickets, and to never return. It was during this time period, and it didn't end under Andy Young, but it's during this time period where public housing, basically, as opposed to fixing it, to remodeling it, giving more services, the idea was to destroy public housing and to push those people outside of Atlanta. So even when there were calls for Section 8 housing or building affordable housing, the idea was to build this in its place, to build mixed use housing, which basically is like the concept that, somehow middle class people living with some poor people is going to rain down on these folks some middle class ethos that is supposed to make things better for them or somehow. It's not like they're getting more resources or anything like that, but somehow osmosisly, by being around middle class people, that's supposed to improve our lives. And so what's happened is that poor people have been pushed out of the city. They've been relocated to sort of suburbs right outside of Atlanta, even though, again, if those folks still serve are a service class to Atlanta, so they still have to come back to Atlanta, which means they have to take the train or the buses, which here in Atlanta don't really go that far in terms of like reaching things, but they have to now come back and do that. The services that they once needed or get may be located in Atlanta. They have to come back and get that. So there's those issues of transportation. Whatever we think about Project Living, no one is saying like it's the best in the world, but people had communities, they had relationships, they knew who could watch their kid, who could they loan money to, who could watch the car, whatever it is. All of that was dispersed for the sake of making Atlanta something shiny and new, not only for the Olympics, but what they hoped would happen afterwards, which is, again, the relocation of corporate headquarters down here in Atlanta. And that's something that, again, from Andy Young all the way up to Kasim Reed, and after Kasim Reed, of course, Keisha Lance Bottoms, and now the current mayor, it's still the general ethos or thinking around what is the purpose of Atlanta in this city, which is to bring corporate entities here and their employees, and those employees need a place to live. It's not like they're giving Atlantans jobs, the people from here from Atlanta jobs. Those folks are relocating and helping to bring a lot of their employees here. And where do these people want to live? They want to live in the city proper. And what does that do again? That pushes people out who've been here, who've lived here, who've built the city, but they're now being pushed out so that other folks can come in. And as you mentioned earlier, Atlanta is no longer a majority Black city. It's like slightly below 50%, which is amazing because at one point Atlanta was close to, if not 70% Black. So the fact that under Black leadership, both the mayorship and the city council, that this has happened shows the class divide and the class interests of not only those elected officials, but obviously the elites who control what those elected officials do and say.
Very, very true. I do also remember one organization that I was part of. We kind of looked into what was going on with the house people here, and we found out that apparently there is an organization or some kind of institution of people who are called ambassadors who started during the Olympics to basically harass like houseless people so that they weren't sleeping on the streets and stuff like that. Because of course they don't do anything to provide homes or anything like that, but they just, what I'm saying, force them to go somewhere else so that they're not seen. And this began during the Olympics, and they still exist today. And most of those people look like us. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like it's just a part of the problem. But I wanted to ask you, what would you say the outside perspective on Atlanta is, and how is it flawed?
I think from the outside, people like me, by the time I moved here, it was a forced move in a sense. My wife went to Spelman, and she didn't want to live in New York anymore, so she wanted to relocate here. And there are some things again that sort of is great about Atlanta, or in the past has been great, as in the cost of living, was something that compared to New York, in terms of sort of your bang for your buck, or the spaciousness of a place where you get to live, raising kids, backyards. It's something that southern cities or cities outside of like the Northeast in particular offer. And that has caused a great return in terms of reverse migration, not only to Atlanta, but other places in the South. It's funny how this started happening, I would say, a lot in the 90s and 2000s, particularly when prices in Northeast and other places got too high. And with the treatment of those northern police, it started to become such a huge issue in terms of the number of stop and frisk and arrest, that people started thinking it's better now to go back to the South, right? Because at no point where we always were in terms of the Black population in the United States, at some points obviously it was well over 90% Black, and during the exodus or the migration to other places, it still stayed approximately 40 something percent Black in general. But now you have the return of Black folks to the South, and not just obviously Atlanta, which has brought the total Black population of the United States to be I think over 50% located now back here in the South. But but in some ways, even 10, 12 years ago, even as Atlanta was going through sort of another boom period of construction and building, there's still also a small town feel to it at times, depending on where you're at. And there's still also that community feel of folks who, again, know each other, depend on each other. But I just don't think the powers that be really care about that. And so even from an outside point of view, where it's pointed to us as this Mecca where you can come make $1 and you can be part of the Black elite and you can do all these other things. When you get here, you do see community, but you see folks who are intervening to stop what's been sort of the history of Atlanta from going any further, and to breed a new history of Atlanta, which again will be majority white. There's going to reach a point where, like other cities that we've seen that once were majority Black, there won't be any Black mayors. The city council will be majority white or other than Black people. And the city will keep on going. They'll keep electing liberal to moderate Democrats in these offices. And it'll be the same thing as generally speaking, Northeast cities or West cities, where it doesn't matter necessarily what race the mayor is, because those people in the elite system have already said to folks, as long as you believe this, you can be a part of it. So as long as you're not upsetting capital, in fact, it makes us look good to have a Black mayor, an Asian mayor occasionally, and a white mayor on occasions. But the money interest stays the same. And I think that's the thing to take a part of it. Even from the outside looking in, it's the money system, it's the interest of who's the ownership class, that stays the same. And that's what they're interested in maintaining.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back in just a moment.
Last year, the Atlanta City Council essentially gave away almost 300 acres of city-owned land to the Atlanta Police Foundation, a conglomeration of corporations, corporate foundations, nonprofits, local university board chairs. They all come together and essentially support the Atlanta Police Department and give it additional funding. They're going to use this particular land to build a mock city of Atlanta, which we call Cop City. It'll be an urban warfare training facility where the police will practice bombs testings, tear gas explosions, a shooting range. Basically, they'll be practicing ways to suppress liberation movements in Atlanta and ways to brutalize and kill poor and working class Black and brown folks here in the city. And we know that this project was encouraged after the uprisings that happened in 2020 when Black folks took to the streets to demand the end of the police occupations in our neighborhood. In particular, Black people liberated the Wendy's on University Avenue, where Rayshard Brooks was murdered by the Atlanta Police Department, and really started to model what it would look like for Black people to have autonomy over our own communities. Now, the business community, city council, all of the wealthy elites in the city saw that, and it frightened them. It frightened them to see that Black people were standing in our own power, and their response was to accelerate the building of Cop City, to shove it through city council, and essentially to use city resources, this 300 acres of land, to build a site where they will be practicing ways to prevent us from having uprisings and from making progress towards our own liberation in the future. Kwame from Community Movement Builders described the project as a war base where police will learn military-like maneuvers to kill Black people and control our bodies and movements. They're practicing how to make sure poor and working class people stay in line. So when the police kill us in the streets again, like they did to Rayshard Brooks in 2020, they can control our protests and community response to how they continually murder our people. And that's exactly what this project is. Now, originally, before Cop City, before this land was a forest, the land was occupied by the Muskogee Creek people, indigenous folks who once lived in the area. They called the river which runs through that forest Wulani. And as many indigenous people were across the country, the Muskogee Creek people were ethnically cleansed from the area during the Trail of Tears. After the Muskogee Creek folks were essentially exterminated and pushed out of their land, Atlanta turned this plot of land into the Atlanta prison farm. Black prisoners were housed here. They were exploited with agricultural labor in the early 1900s. Black prisoners worked in chain gangs at this prison farm, and many were lynched at the site. Black men were regularly imprisoned for things like breaking curfew or whistling at a white woman, right? So it's no surprise that this site that was originally indigenous land, that indigenous folks were kicked off of, that then was occupied by the state to house and catch Black folks who were escaping slavery and indentured servitude to force them to work for free. It is no surprise that this land is now going to be used for Cop City, a place where police, Black, white, all other ethnicities are going to be practicing ways to particularly prevent Black and brown people from poor and working class communities here in Atlanta from being able to organize towards liberation. It's ironic because for many folks, Atlanta is known as the Black Mecca, right? People say you can come to Atlanta, especially if you go to school here at Morehouse, Spelman, any of the other AUC schools, that you can be a part of the, elite class of Black people, be a part of the talented 10th. It's this Mecca, a place where all Black people can thrive. And we know that that's not true. We know that despite Tyler Perry Studios, despite all these Fortune 500 companies, that regular working class Black people here, poor Black people here, they don't experience the spoils of that wealth. They don't experience the progress that everyone wants to talk about Atlanta as. Atlanta is seen as an oasis of Black mobility, but it also has some of the highest inequality in the country. And rapid gentrification is changing our neighborhoods. We organized out of the Pittsburgh neighborhood of Atlanta where housing prices jumped from $50,000 in 2015 to over $400,000 now, where some houses are selling for $750,000. It's clear that the forces that control our communities, these wealthy elites, the police, the business community, the politicians, they're trying to push us out, and Cop City is just another way for them to be able to do that. They're building this mock city so they can suppress our movements. At the same time, they're building housing for cops in our communities, right? So that they'll be even closer to us and even more equipped, both with their resources, their explosive testing, their tear gas, and also their new housing to be able to occupy our communities and make it harder for us to fight back. People say that it's beneficial for Black officers to live in Black neighborhoods. But when we understand that policing evolved out of chattel slavery, out of slave catchers, modern police departments in the South directly evolved from the white militias who are catching Black people who are escaping slavery. We know that it doesn't matter if your overseer is Black or white or any other ethnicity. It's not safe having them live or occupy our communities. So, in essence, this is the context of our city. Atlanta is a segregated city that presents itself as a city that's too busy to hate, that's a Black Mecca where racism doesn't exist, but it is very oppressive towards its Black population and is getting even more and more oppressive. Atlanta is one of the most surveilled cities in the world, and with Cop City, that'll get even worse. Cop City will make Atlanta an example of how cities can support and militarize their own police departments and use them to stop people from organizing, to stop people from protesting, and to stop people from pushing back against their own exploitation. A lot of elected officials in this city, if not all, are on board with this project. They talk about crime, they talk about rebellions, and they use all of that to justify this project. But we have activists, we have organizers, we have people who are in community that care about Black folks, that care about the environmental impacts of this project. They're radicals, abolitionists, local organizers, concerned citizens. All of us are working together to fight and to resist this project. Because we know that if Cop City is completed, it'll accelerate the power of the state, and the implications of that for our climate, for our environment, for our bodies, for our ability to survive in the city are hard to even put into words. So we encourage everyone who hears this, who's listening to this, to really plug into the work and to help us stop Cop City.
We will now be playing Sweetest Dream by Mion.
And we are back. So, a few more questions that I wanted to ask. What are some of the class contradictions that you see in Atlanta? I know you've already touched on this a bit, but could you elaborate a little bit on these differences that exist here between, especially when it comes to the Black ruling class and but even outside of that, the classes that are, living well in Atlanta and the rest of us.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can clearly see it in what the interest of, starting with the Black elite. The interest of the Black elite is to get as close as it can to the white elite and to get those secondary service contracts, or to get those sort of minority contracts that allow for a few people to earn more resources. And again, I think when Maynard Jackson was mayor, he probably more than most did in a good way, I actually, but challenged white capital for sort of the inclusion of Black folks in things like the airport building and so forth and so on. But again, those only impacted a relatively speaking small amount of Black folks, right? But the Black folks with the most influence, and so they have the loudest bullhorn, and so they can tout the necessity for this, because this is Black business and this supposedly brings Black jobs, which it doesn't, but it supposedly brings a multitude of Black jobs. And they tout this stuff. And so their interest is in keeping things cool, calm, and collected. Their interest in making sure that their working class or poor brethren don't rock the ship. Meanwhile, on the other side of that divide, you have the majority of Black folks living hand to hand, check to check. Again, eating the poorest foods, where fast food restaurants are overwhelmingly or abundantly located in our communities, and they become the staple foods, where things like fresh produce and so forth are hard to find, where the control of the local economy is not really in the hands of Black folks either. And there's no institutions or organizations amongst poor Black folks that has a say, really, a predominant say in what happens in their community. So you have a scale where you have some people who have no power, and then you have other people who really don't have much power either, but what they have is influence to try to make some things happen. And in general, they make those things happen for them and others situated in their class, but they sell it to the rest of us as if these are great, great new things that are happening that benefit us all, where they don't benefit us all. In fact, I would say most of the time when you're in cities that have been run, particularly since the 1970s, but cities that have been run by Black mayors and Black city councils, they have tended to be some of the most conservative cities in the country when it actually comes to policy and policing and jobs and so forth. The most progressive cities are usually the whitest cities, right? Because they don't mind redistributing resources to themselves in a way in which, when those cities have too many Black folks in them, all of a sudden Black folks are unfairly taking resources, unfairly doing certain things. And so therefore, we're going to stop with any distribution of resources. So I think that great divide is something that gets hidden a lot of times in Atlanta, because the voices that are allowed to speak through media are the voices of the elite, who get to talk about what either they own, their closeness to capital, their closeness to elected officials. People get to talk about how they grew up in Atlanta and how they, quote unquote, made it here. And so therefore, the general conditions of the impoverished, the poor folks, again, who make up the majority of Atlanta Black folks and always have, they are considered or treated as hindrances to what's good for the larger amount of Black people. And so therefore, when they're over policed, that's okay. When they're pushed out of Atlanta, that's okay. When they don't have access to resources or jobs, that's okay, because they are a hindrance in terms of what the elite Black or the mismanagement class of Black folks are looking to have. And that's what they're looking to have influence and wealth over any sort of larger community or Black struggle that gives us all resources, as opposed to what's going to them in their pockets.
Yeah, it just kind of goes to show how, like, ideology is a powerful thing. People, like, can be made through propaganda to look at their slavery as their salvation. And that is, I mean, the story of Atlanta, basically. People think that this, just because some, like, Black people or other people can come here and, get rich, or even be people from here and become super wealthy, that means that this is a great place for everyone, when it has always been true that for the majority of people, it has not been great. Conditions have always been exploitative. They've always been oppressive. And, things just continue in that way. But I also wanted to ask, how bad would you say the gentrification is in Atlanta?
Oh, I think at this stage, it's probably one of the worst in the country. But you've had, traditionally speaking, poor and working class Black communities that are almost wiped out. These communities basically there's only a small amount of these communities, relatively speaking, left. And the target is now on these communities. Like, for instance, we work in South Atlanta, in the Pittsburgh area, Southeast Atlanta. And what we see in places like Pittsburgh and Mechanicsville and other places close by is that that property is being targeted, not only by local developers, but also big companies that are working in real estate, which are looking to buy homes and rent them at a certain amount and use that rent to pay dividends in terms of stock holdings and bonds and so forth. So I would say right now, Atlanta is at a crucial time where if in general, people And I think people are aware, but if people are not, if people become aware and start to fight back, it's going to be the only way to stop Atlanta from where it's headed. And you can clearly see by walking down the street, by going to different places, that Atlanta is not the city it was 30 or 40 years ago, or even 10 or 20 years ago, even in terms of the amount of development and how that development happens. Again, the fact that these working class neighborhoods basically have no say in how development happens in their community, which allows them, whether they're homeowners or not, which allows them to get pushed out. And as opposed to fighting back against that in certain ways, again, even at the neighborhood level, we get tricked into thinking, again, if something is shiny and new, that somehow in a neighborhood that was meant for us, and so it's going to be an improvement, when really what it's doing is jacking up prices, jacking up taxes, and it's things that you never were going to use anyway. And it's meant for that new population of people who are coming in to use while you get pushed out. So I just think we have here sort of gentrification on steroids that's starting to happen in Atlanta, and there's very little time to do something about it.
That is definitely true. But on the subject of fighting back, I did want to ask you about organizing in Atlanta. What do you think the barriers to organizing in Atlanta are?
I think some of the barriers here they're not that different from a lot of other places. People like to regionalize a lot of stuff and think that the conditions in particular that people are struggling against here are somehow foreign to other places across the country. And so oppression may look a little different sometimes in terms of what the South has gone through and what folks in, again, the North and or West will go to. But you'll find that, in digging in some of those particulars, the oppression remains the same, as in police brutality impacts all of us all around the country. That, again, the lack of resources impacts all of us around the country. Having sort of a sellout leadership class, whether or not those folks are in office or just the heads of churches. But again, they're far more interested, and I pick out churches because they're probably one of the few standing institutions in our communities. But the interest to cuddle up to elites far surpasses most of the time the interest in making sure that you're fighting for Black folks to have resources in the community. So I think part of the struggle here in Atlanta, again, as I've seen in other places, is that people are working jobs or tired or deflated. And that extra organizing is something that they just would not rather do because they have other things that they want to do. And whether or not that's just relaxing and having a beer, whether or not that's watching your favorite soap opera, whether or not that's partying, whatever it is, it's like, look, I need some relaxed time. And you want to take my relaxed time and have me organized. And so sometimes you got to get over a hurdle. You got to show folks or be with folks to show like what's going to make the difference in terms of if we do this organizing, maybe we can stay in these neighborhoods longer. Maybe we can redirect some capital to the things that we need. Maybe we can create alternative institutions that serve our communities, our families better, right? So I think those things are always the chief hurdles when it comes to fighting back around oppression, is whether or not you can convince sort of poor working class folks in enough numbers, right? You'll have an activist class of folks who in general will help do a lot of work, but it's whether or not any of us or all of us can convince enough working class poor folks to join in those struggles, because they'll start to see the benefit of those struggles. And sometimes that means that we have to create those alternatives for folks to see, and you can't just talk in people's ear, right? Because folks are tired of talking. They've heard the best talkers in the world, right? They don't, we are poor carbon copies of some of the folks who stood before us in terms of being able to talk about what our conditions are. And so, being able to do that is one thing. We're at the stage now, I think, where the best organizations have shown at least a little bit, given a little insight into what the difference can be when we as Black people organize. And I go all the way back to a UNIA, to sometimes in part of the history of the nation, to some of the history of the Black Panther Party, to some of the history of SNCC and others, where they started creating some of the alternatives that we need to see, which I think embolden people to join for a longer time. So not just mobilizing, but actually joining and doing that day-to-day struggle. So I think that's incumbent to, even sometimes more than seeing something wrong, right, with the folks that we are trying to get to organize. The question really is, what are we doing right or wrong as those who profess to care enough and to be skillful enough and to want to do this work? What are we doing to get the masses or get people involved in these organizations and this activism to do something about fighting for resources?
That's a really good point. Taking responsibility and trying to figure out what is the best way that we can reach people. But as the last question, I did want to ask, like, what do you think are the broader lessons that we can learn about the condition of Black people in this country from how Atlanta actually is, from the conditions that are present in Atlanta?
I think you hit on this earlier, right? That every brother and every sister and everybody and every they, right? ain't down with the neighborhood, ain't down with the community. People, the analysis is that this structure was meant to oppress, and this structure has been smart enough over time periods to readjust itself. And when I say this structure, I mean capitalist white supremacy, which dominates America, imperialism, which America dominates overseas. That this structure knows how to survive. And it will take different shapes and forms. Obviously, it's not like a smooth line, right? There's struggle even within elites about how to move forward. But in general, it has shown itself to be able to open up enough to take people in who at once overtly oppress, to continue to oppress, but oppress in a sort of different ways, but to take enough of certain amounts of people into it to cause people to have sort of a be blindsided or a blindness as to how oppression works. And I think Atlanta, for a long part of its history, has been particularly good at that because it early on got a percentage of the Black elite to basically side with the white economic elite in deciding how Atlanta should be run. And again, it should be run for the benefit of capital. And that's what those folks did. And that's become part of the example nationally of trying to figure out, like, how do we get out this mess? So Atlanta's been very good at readjusting early to make sure that it stays off a lot of the rebellions that have happened in the past. But to make sure, again, that people are fighting for jobs or fighting amongst themselves for jobs as opposed to fighting for power. And I think the lack thereof of the struggle for power is what leads us to fight amongst ourselves and to fight these small time interests that we have as individuals, as opposed to joining up together to fight for real power and something that's going to dismantle, change, revolutionize, have a revolution, this system, as opposed to going along with it and slow walking ourselves to death.
Very, very true. All right. So, y'all, this was Kamau Franklin, founder of Community Movement Builders. And I mean, that's really sums up the myth of the Black Mecca. I mean, it really is, we have this idea that Atlanta is a certain way. And I don't know if a lot of people really know how it actually is, but I hope that this was helpful in showing people what things really are like. So thank you.